So, you had a segment on CNN here where some truth got out, and Trump was called a war criminal. And what's interesting is the over-the-top reaction from Brian Stelter.
I find myself, Carl, after a week full of Trump delusion headlines, wondering where we are heading as a country. Where do you see us heading?
Well, I think we need to slow down a bit and deconstruct some of the things that you've just laid out there. The first thing is I'm not a psychiatrist, and God knows all of us may have a degree of narcissism, but when we're talking about Trump, we're obviously talking about a kind of delusional madness, such as General Milley was talking about, that is on a scale and a scope that we have never experienced in an American president in our history. I think we need to calmly step back and maybe look at Trump in a different context. He is our own American war criminal, of a kind we've never experienced before.
You just said war criminal. What do you mean, war criminal?
I did. Well, in international law, there have been, quote, crimes against humanity. I think what we're talking about, Trump's crimes as an American war criminal in his own country that he has perpetrated upon our people, including the tens of thousands of people who died because of his homicidal negligence in the pandemic, putting his own electoral interests above the health of our people as they were slaughtered in this pandemic. Looking at his actions in terms of fomenting a coup to hold on to office in which the head of the American military, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has now compared Trump, not the press, not reporters comparing Trump to Hitler, but rather the head of the American military comparing him and his movement to brown shirts, to the Reichstag fire. This is a huge wake-up call to this country when General Milley, the head of the American military, has said this. And it fits as a piece with something so extraordinary in our history. It's not political. Trump is not just political. He transcends the political, and we need to start looking at his crimes in that context.
You're going to get heat for talking about war crimes because there's, it's not as if the ICC is setting up a panel or anything, taking any action.
I want to be careful.
Immediately cucked. The ICC should do that. They should do that. As Noam Chomsky famously said, if the Nuremberg laws were upheld, every post-World War II American president would have been hanged. And that is still true to this day. And it's amazing that Brian Stelter is on CNN and he doesn't know that, or he does know that, but he lies about it. It's either ignorance or stupidity or lies. Because this isn't a debatable question. Now, by the way, Bernstein's answer there was terrible because he says, oh, he's a war criminal. Then he says he's a war criminal in his own country because of COVID deaths. There was homicidal negligence. No. Don't redefine war crime for that. He's a war criminal in the traditional sense. His very first approved raid as president was a raid that Obama refused to approve because there was very terrible evidence for it. It's a raid in Yemen that ended up killing a 7-year-old American girl. An American girl was killed with no due process, with no trial. She was 7. I'd say that's a war crime. You know what else is a war crime? Illegally and unconstitutionally assassinating Qasem Soleimani. There was no declaration of war against Iran. There was no declaration of war or any approval or any process or any steps. Just willy-nilly decided to assassinate a top Iranian commander. You can't do that. If Iran willy-nilly decided to assassinate a top American commander, would we be like, that's cool, that's not illegal? Of course it's illegal. What are you talking about? And the list goes on and on. Trump famously got rid of the few rules and guardrails when it came to the drone war. Now, it was already illegal because we're droning in countries where there is no declaration of war, like Somalia, for example. But Trump got rid of all the rules. Obama had a 90% civilian death rate. Trump probably had worse, or maybe not a worse as a percentage, but worse in terms of he increased the bombing. He increased drone strikes by 432% over the Obama administration. These things are war crimes. These things are war crimes. Like, the war crimes are war crimes. Look at what happened with Iran. You want to talk about the International Criminal Court? The International Criminal Court said the U.S. needs to stop sanctioning the medicine going into Iran. And the U.S. said, LOL, bro, not happening. And then we pulled out of the court and started chastising them and continued to sanction medicine going into Iran. And people died as a result of it. We have criminal sanctions on Venezuela, for example. We have a criminal embargo on Cuba. He's a war criminal. He's absolutely a war criminal. But of course, Bernstein brings up none of that because to a lot of liberal elites, people overseas just don't count. He brings up COVID deaths. Now, COVID deaths are horrible, and there was homicidal negligence, but it's not a war crime. It's not a war crime. It's not the same thing. It's just a different category. So, terrible answer, but imagine being Brian Stelter. You work in news for a living, and you're like apoplectic at the idea of Trump being called a war criminal. And by the way, just so we're clear, they're trying to make it sound like, oh, Trump is uniquely bad and that he's an American war criminal. Again, every post-World War II president is a war criminal. Every single one. So look at Obama. I just told you, 90% civilian death rate. He also, with the drones, he also killed Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. That's a 16-year-old American boy. And when they killed him with a drone, they then turned around and said, well, he should have had a better father. Because his father may have been a terrorist. Anwar al-Awlaki. Imagine saying that. What do we assassinate people based on the crimes of their parents? This is an American. No due process, no trial, no nothing. They killed him. They blew him up with a sky predator. That's a war crime. That's a war crime. I mean, we don't even need to get into George W. Bush. George W. Bush is probably worse than Trump, even though it's by a little bit. He probably is worse than Trump. Started the war in Iraq, started the war in Afghanistan, started torture, started the illegal NSA spying on all Americans. And so he's a war criminal for sure. An illegal war based on lies that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. But then that leads me to my final point, which is they make the comparison Trump's like Hitler or the brown shirts. This is what's so annoying about corporate media is that, so they should be criticizing Trump because that's substantive. But the way they criticize him is shitty. Again, they didn't make the actual points about how he's a war criminal. And then they're also like needlessly hyperbolic. That makes people go like, I don't know about that one, man. I mean, I know Trump is terrible, but Hitler? Hitler. And so, you know, again, I would say that if you look at their records objectively, I think Bush was a little worse than Trump. So does that mean Bush is like super Hitler? It's just do me a favor. Only invoke the Hitler and Nazi analogies in like the rarest of rare circumstances. Because they do throw it around willy-nilly. And they just dislike Trump, so they throw it around for him like it's nothing. But anyway, man, it's so pathetic that he was like outraged at the idea of Trump being a war criminal. Of course he's a fucking war criminal. Of course Obama's a war criminal. Of course Bush is a war criminal. And anybody who follows this stuff who doesn't have the mind of a toddler can admit that.